Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Here to welcome you into episode number 154. Today we're going to be taking a quick look at an album that, for many, many years was one of those elusive white whales in my record collection. The album in question, which was released back in 1986, is entitled Fresh by Jamaican club legend, the immortal Sophia George. Sophia George was born on February 21st, 1964 in Kingston, Jamaica. George, who grew up in a devoutly religious home, first began flexing her pipes in a very comfortable and familiar setting. That being church, her friends and family often encouraged her to take her talent beyond the walls of God's house and, share her gift with the rest of the world. But despite her massive talent, for Sophia George, music was not her first passion, it was education. So instead of lighting up the local discotheques, she instead decides to perch herself on a much more humble stage, teaching hearing-impaired children. This was a career path that she took very seriously. This was something that she was very good at. She relished the opportunity to contribute something positive to her community by serving those that were less fortunate than herself. But eventually, through persistent nagging by those in her inner circle, Sophia George is eventually persuaded to take up a meeting with Ronald Chung, a Jamaican producer who at the time was out there on the prowl, seeking out Jamaica's next female vocal sensation. It was during her meeting with Ronald Chung that Sophia George was presented with a little tune that was going to forever alter the trajectory of her life. The song that was written by Jamaican songwriter Sanjay Davis, the man who was also responsible for writing Bob Marley's hit Wake Up and Live. The song was called Girly Girly. And during the course of her audition with Sophia George, after having just sung a few bars, Ronald Chung comes busting into the studio. He cuts her off. Essentially, he has heard everything it is that he needs to hear. He is utterly convinced that unlike Bono, he has finally found what it was that he was looking for. But despite Chung's enthusiasm, Sophia George remains apprehensive. She does not see herself as a struggling pop star in search of a recording contract. Instead, she sees herself as a successful and devoted teacher, someone with a career and students that depend on her. But ignoring all of Sophia George's reservations, Chung, who immediately recognizes her potential, books her into a studio, and in 1985, she releases her debut single for the song that she had first been presented with in her first meeting with Ronald Chung, that being Girly Girly. And to put it lightly, absolute all hell breaks loose. The song is an immediate smash and soon can be heard booming from clubs, cars, and backyard barbecues all over the tropical island. The song would eventually reach number 1 on the Jamaican charts, where it lived for 11 weeks. The song also flexed its international appeal by reaching number 7 in the UK and number 2 in the Netherlands. Not long after this, hoping to build off of the momentum from their first single, Ronald Chung and Sophia George re-enter the studio, and in 1986, she releases her first full-length studio album, which is entitled Fresh. Now, despite the fact that this record would produce 3 other sort of minor-size hits in Jamaica, it is the song Girly Girly that would forever define Sophia George's very brief recording career. In fact, in 2011, the song experienced sort of a resurgence in popularity when it was covered by Blondie on their album Panic of Girls. In 1987, Sophia George and Ronald Chung, who were by this time an item, welcomed their first son Patrick into the world, at which point in time, Sophia George makes a conscious decision that she is going to step away from the music industry. She is going to focus all of her time and her energy on her young family. In 1997, the family relocated from Jamaica to Miami before eventually settling in Los Angeles, California, at which point in time, Sophia George just sort of willingly fades into relative obscurity, relegating herself in many people's eyes as another one of those 80s one-hit wonders. Now, as a fan, this is something that I sort of have a hard time reconciling, because musical talent is something that I am simply so envious of when it comes to others. And to have somebody like Sophia George, who was so absolutely gifted, make a conscious decision to simply walk away is something that I have a very hard time wrapping my mind around. But at the end of the day, I suppose that's why it is that she is an icon, and I'm left doing this sad little show, son. Anyway, as I mentioned before, this was an album that for many, many years managed to evade my grasp. That is, until this past November, when my wife and I went out for Black Friday Record Store Day. Now, I've mentioned it on this channel many times in the past. Record Store Day was something that I used to attend devoutly. But over time, it was something that I had sort of fallen out of the habit of. That was until a couple of years ago, when it was announced that they were going to be re-releasing the classic Sister Nancy album, 1-2. This was an album that actually managed to drag my barnacle-covered carcass out of the house for Record Store Day. This was something that I had not done in many, many years, despite the fact that I always want a lot of the records that are being released on Record Store Day. In my opinion, it had simply become too much of a chore for me to endure. But this year on Black Friday, my wife had sort of told me that she was interested in going out to Black Friday because there were a couple of things coming out this year that she was interested in. There was certainly a couple of things that I was interested in this year as well. Number one being the reissue of the first Dead Milkmen album, Big Lizard in My Backyard, which turned out absolutely phenomenal. Dead Milkmen are not only one of my favorite bands of all time, I would make the argument that this is one of the most important American punk rock records ever recorded. It is an album that for some reason I had never owned on vinyl until this past Black Friday Record Store Day. My wife and I went out early that day, as is the custom on Record Store Day. Now, one of the things that is great about living in Nashville, as much as at times I can bust Nashville's balls, one of the great things about living in this city is the world-class music venues and the saturation that we have here of just excellent record stores. So on Black Friday, my wife and I decided to go out and hit a couple of our local spots in search of what it was that we were seeking, and eventually we ended up at a place in Franklin, Tennessee, a place that I mentioned on my last video talking about the Morrissey listening party, a place called Luna Records, which in my opinion is probably the second best record store here in Nashville. The place is an absolute treasure. Everybody that works there is awesome. The building that the record store in is so much fun, and it's a place that my wife and I have a tendency to end up more often than we care to admit to others. And as we got to Record Store Day on Black Friday, I immediately was able to get my grubby mitts on this particular copy of this particular record. My wife also managed to find what it was that she was looking for, some Wicked-related swag. And after we picked up what we were there to pick up, my wife and I decided to hang out for a little while, at which point in time I decided to dig through the bins, as I always do. And being the type of person I am, listening to the music that I listen to, one of the first bins that I'm always drawn into whenever it comes to any record store that I am patronizing, of course, is the Jamaican music section. Now, unfortunately, one of my main quibbles about living in Nashville is this is simply not a Jamaican music hotbed. So if you go into any of our local record stores, you're typically pretty lucky if they have about a half a crate of Jamaican records, which is sort of typically the case at this place in Franklin called Luna Records. Now, the half a crate of Jamaican records they have, I would make the argument, are usually pretty high quality, but unfortunately most of them are records that I already own. So on Black Friday, after picking up my copy of Big Lizard in My Backyard by the Dead Milkmen, I decided to peruse around a little bit, and I started digging through the Jamaican crate, and I got about 2/3 of the way through it. I don't know if this is something you do, but typically, as I'm digging through the crates, I get about 2/3 of the way to 3/4 of the way through it. I think to myself, all right, there probably isn't anything in here for me today, but I would be remiss if I don't see this journey to the end. And I remember digging through the crate on Black Friday, reaching the very back of the Jamaican vinyl section, and I stumbled upon this little nugget, and I literally let out an audible yelp. I'm assuming that the people around me thought that I had just starched my trunks in public, which honestly wasn't too far from the truth, because this is an album that I have literally been looking for many, many years. Now, it is easy to go online, whether it be on Discogs, Amazon, or eBay, and just order the records that you want. Trust me, I've done that. I mean, I can show you my eBay invoices, son. It would make your hair fall out. But this was one of those records that I just made the decision a long time ago. It was going to be much more fun going out and finding in the wild. And this was one of those records that, not saying every time I went into a record store it was just tattooed on my frontal lobe as if this was the only thing I was looking for, but it was a record, especially whenever I would dig through the Jamaican crates, this was a record that I always wanted to get my hands on. I could not believe that I was finally meeting it face to face, and honestly, as if that was not snug enough, this is an original Jamaican pressing from 1986. Now, assuming that this record was at one time purchased in Jamaica, which romantically is what I like to believe happened, I can't help but wonder. Now, this is the type of things that I think about, because as I've mentioned on this channel in the past, I have no friends, I have no life, I have no prospects. So in order to occupy my free time, what I do is I sit around and think about things that nobody else in the world could possibly care less about. But I remember thinking to myself, if this record was in fact purchased in Jamaica, which I'm going to tell myself is the case romantically, how in the hell did this album end up in Franklin, Tennessee, of all places? Not that I know the answer, but not that I'm going to complain either, because now it resides where it always belonged, right here in this record store with me. Now, my personal relationship with Sophia George, I think, began back in probably 1996 or 1997, right around the time I moved to the Bay Area from my hometown in Northern California, right around the time I first began getting into Jamaican music. One of the things I used to do back in those days is I would purchase compilation albums, and I used these compilation albums as tools to sort of turn myself on to artists that I had otherwise been unfamiliar with. And I remember specifically when I started getting into Jamaican music, I mean, this was like a foreign country to me. This was not a style of music that I grew up listening to. And, you know, back in those days, I've talked about this on this channel all the time. I don't want to be that old man who sits on his front porch lecturing the young children about what life was like back in the 1990s, but back in those days, you know, before the streaming services, before YouTube, before Spotify, before Apple Music, if you wanted to listen to music, you had to go out there into the wild, among the animals. You had to drop your duckage on the counter, and there were times when buying a new album proved to be a risk. And I remember what a bummer it was to buy an album based on a song or two songs that maybe you liked and have the rest of the album be a total bucket. So what I did, because I was on a relatively fixed budget back in those days, was I bought compilation albums, and if there were artists on those albums that I liked, then I would take the risk, I guess I should say, and go out and actually purchase the album. I remember buying a compilation album, not for the song Girly Girly, but I bought a compilation album very early on in my Jamaican record collecting days. It had the song Girly Girly on it, and there was just something about it that immediately grabbed me. It pulled me in. It is a song that I've always loved, a song that I still love to this day. So not long after that, I went out and I Bought myself a Sophia George compilation on CD. This was a sort of greatest hits package, which at the end of the day, considering that she only released one album back in 1986, putting out a best of album seems a little bit redundant, but I am not a person that is qualified to question the judgment of the immortal Trojan Records. So I lived with this compilation for many, many years, hoping, praying to God or whatever it is that you believe in, that someday I was going to get my mitts on the official release, which I finally did in November. This album is now safely adopted. This record is going to live with me until I have enough common decency to go tits up, and probably for a couple of years after that. Now, this is an album, as I mentioned before, that was released back in 1986. This is an album that it sort of combines elements of dancehall roots, disco, and hip-hop. I would say that much like a lot of the Jamaican albums that came out in the 1980s, the production on this album is a tiny bit heavy-handed. I mean, it isn't anything that is criminal. But I am a firm believer that within the realm of Jamaican music, production is a very fine line. I think that sometimes if you cross over into production that is a little bit too heavy-handed, I think it has a tendency to kill the music. Now, in the 1980s, it didn't necessarily bother me as much when it came to artists who were current, people like Sophia George, but if you go back and you listen to some of the records that were put out by people like Jimmy Cliff in the 1980s, I mean, the production became so intrusive that at a certain point in time, it almost ceased sounding like roots reggae music, at least in my very humble opinion. This is an album, though, that I absolutely love. This is an album that I never get tired of. This is a record that if you are a fan of Jamaican music and you have not heard it, this is an artist that for some reason you are unfamiliar with, I would stop this video right now, which is probably the most sound advice I've ever given you. Leap over to your Spotify, Apple Music, or YouTube, or wherever it is that you stream music, and just start jamming to this masterpiece, because this album, in my opinion, is about as good as anything that came out around this same era in terms of Jamaican music. The song kicks off, or the album kicks off, I should say, with actually my favorite song on the album, which is Make You Feel Fine. That has always been pretty much my favorite Sophia George song. It is a great way to kick off the record. The song does, in fact, make me feel fine. After that, it goes into a song called Tenement Yard, which is a song about inflation and the cost of living. A song that is as relevant today as it was back in 1986. 40 years ago! 1986 was 40 years ago. Are you serious right now? That is ridiculous, son. Anyway, the third song off this album is a song called Ain't No Meaning. This was one of the songs on the album that sort of reached a minor hit status in Jamaica. This song does feature an artist that, much like Sophia George, unfortunately, is someone that I don't want to say is forgotten in today's world of Jamaican music, but somebody that is gravely underappreciated, that being Charlie Chaplin. The next song after that is a song called It Burned My Belly, which I'm convinced is about hot Cheetos. That is a song that also became one of the bigger hits off of this record. Side 1 closes out with the song Girly Girly, of course I mentioned. That song was written by Sanjay Davis. That is the song that will forever define Sophia George's relatively brief recording career. A lot of people, based on the song Girly Girly, as I mentioned before, a lot of people have sort of relegated Sophia George as being just another one of those 80s one-hit wonders. I simply disagree with that sentiment. In my opinion, my definition of what an 80s, or not even an 80s, my definition of what a one-hit wonder is probably different than a lot of people. My definition of a one-hit wonder is somebody that literally has like one good song. The band that I always use as an example of this is something that does not make my best friend Tim out in California happy, but that is Delight. The song, What is the song? Groove is in the Heart is an amazing song. Everything else the band ever did is pretty much junk. Sophia George, this entire album is very listenable. So to refer to her as a one-hit wonder is something that I simply do not agree with. Side 2 starts off with a song called Lazy Body, which I think was written about me in my middle age. The next song after that is called Honestly I Do. That is a song I love. My second favorite song off this record is the third song on side 2. It is a song called I Can't Live Without You. That is a song that I always include on every one of my little lovey-dovey playlists that I make for my lovely bride. It is a tradition that her and I have gotten into over the course of our relationship where we always make each other these sort of cute little playlists, and that is a song that I never leave off of mine. Another great song, which was written by Sanjay Davis, is called I Just Love You. Sanjay Davis, in my opinion, is probably one of the more underrated Jamaican songwriters of all time. The album closes with a song called Dance With You, which is a song that I absolutely love as well. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this album is in every way perfect, but I can tell you that I don't really think there's a bad song on this entire album. In fact, I think you would be hard-pressed. You might have to bring out your magnifying glass if you were interested in finding even a bad second on this album. This is an album that is so good that I can't help but wonder what would have happened to Sophia George had she decided to sort of continue on with her recording career and not walk away after just one album. But I do suppose, because this album is so good, that if you are just going to make one album and then essentially retire, willfully fade into relative obscurity. I have read that Sophia George, who is a very private person, was not somebody that was necessarily enamored by her time in the public eye. So if you are going to make one album and retire, I do believe that this is a pretty excellent mic drop album. So if you've not listened to Sophia George's album, Fresh, I can't possibly recommend it enough. In fact, I might end this video right now and put this record on and boogie, son. Anyway, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store, like Luna Records in Franklin, Tennessee. Check back for Morrissey Monday, a celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. No? You're good? Nothing else? I'm good. You're good. We're all good. So in that case, until next time, my friends, talk to you then.